Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, and today I'm here with Jim Slaughter, who is the president of Law Firm Carolinas and a big deal parliamentarian. He is a certified professional parliamentarian and past president of the American College of Parliamentary Lawyers, and a parliamentarian to many of the largest trade and professional organizations in the country. He's written 4 books on Robert's Rules of Order and running proper meetings, including 2 recent books updated for the latest Robert's Rules of Order Fast Track, and Notes and Comments on Robert's Rules 5th edition. Jim Slaughter, welcome to the Grammar Girl podcast.
Thank you, Mignon.
Yeah, so you are obviously very into meetings and parliamentary procedure, and there are all sorts of fascinating words we're going to talk about today related to meetings and parliamentary procedure. But first, can you tell me why all of this is so important?
Certainly, Mignon. And a lot of people, when they think parliamentary procedure, meetings, they probably think about high school student council. But actually, if you think about it, we end up in all sorts of meetings out in life. There are religious meetings with churches, there are HOA and condo meetings, there's every imaginable type of charity and nonprofit meeting, in addition to all the governmental bodies like school boards, city councils, county commissions. And so there are millions of meetings every year in the United States, and most tend to follow some form of procedure for their meetings.
Mhm. Are there different kinds of I mean, I would imagine that it's different for, an HOA meeting than it is for a meeting with, 5,000, 10,000 people, like an
It,
annual
there,
meeting.
there is. You're exactly right. There is a difference. The main breakdown is it generally tends to be that the larger a meeting is, the more formal it has to be. Small boards, committees do not need to be nearly so formal. I think you mentioned to me you'd had a student council experience. One of the problems is a lot of people think there's one procedure for every size meeting, and that's not the case. It does tend to get more formal as you get bigger, less formal as you tend to get smaller.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, how do you help organizations institute parliamentary procedure or run big meetings?
Well, and in any size meeting, there is a legal aspect to this procedure, which is if you don't give enough notice of a meeting, if you don't wait till enough people are there, if you take the wrong kind of a vote, you may find out that you actually didn't do what you thought you were going to do at all. So there's a legal aspect, but I'd really like to instead, for purposes of this podcast, focus on the proper procedure, and proper terms can make meetings shorter. It can make them fair. It can make the person who's running the meeting look like they know what they are doing. So my role as a parliamentarian is make sure the business gets done and that everybody looks good at the end of the meeting.
Now, is parliamentary procedure the same thing as Robert's Rules of Order?
It is not. It's a broader term. In fact, parliamentary, since we're going to talk words today, I know lots of your readers are on top of this. Parliamentary comes from the concept of parliament in England. Parliamentary procedure is everything that goes into running a legal and effective meeting. Robert's Rules is a book on parliamentary procedure written in the 1800s, and it gets updated about every 10 years.
Oh, great. So kind of like the Chicago Manual of Style, which is updated every 7 years or so.
That is
Um,
exactly right.
yeah. And are there other books? Is it always Robert's Rules of Order, or are there others too?
It's not always Roberts. Roberts is the 800-pound gorilla of the parliamentary procedure world. So for groups that use a parliamentary book, the number that use Roberts tends to be very high. But different groups use different books. If we were a group of physicians or dentists, we would almost certainly use some version of a book called the Standard Code, which was first written by Alice Sturgis in 1950. Other groups have their specific books that they like, either because of history or because there are practices in them that fit their group.
Okay. Well, let's get to the words. That's always the great part of this podcast. Why don't we start with bylaws?
When bylaws is a good one to start with because the bylaws for an organization are the documents that govern it. It used to be called the Constitution or the Constitution and bylaws. Bylaws used to have a hyphen in it, BY hyphen laws. But the history on it's kind of interesting. I know you did a podcast once on Old English and Middle English. It's actually a Norse word. BY appears in some English cities like Whitby and Derby, and I'm told that means that it was settled by Vikings.
Hmm.
The word by means village or town, and so if you break it down, bylaws just really mean the town laws. And nowadays, that's what associations and other bodies have. It's their governing documents.
And isn't that great? I would have thought for sure that by law would have been by the preposition, by the law, but it actually means the town law. That's so great. Um, what are some of the other words that are interesting words that are commonly used in the meetings?
And you asked me to pull a couple of words that you don't have to know these words to go to a meeting, but it adds some flavor to the meeting. And again, a lot of people walk into meetings and they'll hear bylaws or they'll hear quorum or they'll hear majority. And if it's not a word you're familiar with, it can be a very foreign experience. And so by knowing some of these words, it makes it a better meeting and you'll have a better feeling for what's going on. Quorum is another word that comes up, and quorum is a Latin word. For meetings, it means how many people have to be there for it to be a legal meeting. How many people need to show up before you start voting on things because you don't want to be voting on things without enough people there for it to be representative for the group. Quorum just means of whom. And basically, in England in olden times, when they would appoint justices of the peace, the commission appointing them would say that either one of them or some of them had to be present before they could transact any business. And that's pretty much what it means for meetings, which is we want enough people here so that it's not some small group making a decision on behalf of the big group that is unrepresentative. You always want a quorum before you start voting on things at a meeting.
Right. And then you talked about majority. Like if you want a majority of that quorum, it doesn't mean what a lot of people think it means, right?
And the history is not as exciting. It comes from majorite, but it's used wrong so often. I'm happy you raised it, and by that I mean I hear on excellent news stations or reporting on Congress or governmental meetings that usually majority will be said to mean 51%. It does not mean that. Or I will hear that it means half plus one. It also doesn't mean that. Majority just means more than half. So depending on the size of your group or depending on whether you have fractional interests, majority might just be 50.00001%. And if you use one of those other numbers I just threw out, you're very likely going to end up with a wrong number. So majority just means more than half, however small that might be.
Right. So if you have 100%, then 51% is more than half. But if you have, 1,000 people, it might be, I don't know, 50.05%. I don't know. Grammar girl
You're,
does math. Don't trust my math. But
your math may be better than mine, but yes, if it's 1,000 people, a majority will have 500. It would probably be 501 unless you're voting fractionally. But let's say there are 1,001 people. Ooh, well, half is 500 and a half. Well,
mm,
if you said majority is 51%, you're going to get a wrong number. If you say it's half plus add a whole nother one, that's wrong too. Again, a majority just means more than half, however small that might be.
yeah. And since we're on math terms, you mentioned division. That sounded like another interesting word.
It is mainly because it's so visual. In a meeting, frequently votes are taken by the chair asking, would all those in favor say aye, aye? Would all those opposed say no, no? And it's often very clear. But if it's not clear, anybody can, under Roberts, can ask for a division. A division just means I just want to see the vote. I'd like to divide the room. I'd like everybody who's in favor to stand. I'd like everybody who's opposed to stand. We're not going to count. We're just going to eyeball it. But the word division comes from Parliament, where there are actually two separate doors in the back of the room, where when they do a division or divide the House, different members go to a different door and walk in through separate entrances in the room and get counted, somewhat like maybe cattle.
So I've never been in a meeting like this. So people are physically getting up and moving around?
Well, again, that's Parliament dividing by doors, but in the United States and in typical parliamentary procedure these days, or in Roberts, all a division these days means is, hey, now that we did a voice vote, it wasn't clear enough. Let's just have everybody stand up who's in favor and sit down. Everybody who's opposed, stand up and sit down, and we'll do a quick eyeball. But the history of the word division, because you might wonder, why is this called a division? Is it actually comes from a time when the yeses and the nos were actually divided in the room.
Hmm. And in Zoom meetings, do they have people, like, digitally raise their hands or something like that?
If you're in a virtual meeting, you're exactly right because you've been on lots of meetings virtually as everybody else has these days. There is a device within the Zoom meeting where you can raise hands, and sometimes in virtual meetings, people will send in their vote as a text message so that you have a recording of it
Mm.
permanently. The main issue with virtual meetings, which we may talk about in a bit, is there needs to be some basis for doing a virtual meeting. There either needs to be a statute that allows you to do it, or there needs to be something in the bylaws because a virtual meeting is not automatically the same as an in person meeting.
Something in those bylaws in the town law. So is it true that there is no next order of business?
Well, I know you and I chatted just briefly about that one. You will regularly, in almost any meeting you go to, and it's almost something that's used outside of meetings now, where someone will make reference to the next order of business. And without getting too complicated here, there is one order of business for a meeting. The order of business is a type of an agenda, but it's everything that's going to happen in that meeting generally from the beginning, when the meeting's called to order, all the way to the adjournment. And so there's one order of business. And so to say the next order of business is sort of like saying the next week of the day. It's backwards. The proper phrase in Roberts, and you will not find the phrase next order of business in Roberts. A better phrase would be something like the next item of business, because there's just one order of business. Again, the parliamentary police are not going to show up at your meeting and do something if you use the wrong term on these. But if you're running a meeting, you may want to use the right phrases so that people understand that you know something about running a meeting.
I'm just off imagining the parliamentary police and what
You
they
don't
might look
don't
like.
imagine that. It's horrifying. It's horrifying.
Do they have gavels on their belts? They have tri-corner hats. So you mentioned adjournment. You told me that was an interesting word too.
Well, only in that, again, it's a word that's thrown around a lot inside and outside of meetings. We're going to adjourn. There's an adjournment for a meeting. All an adjournment means, or to adjourn, just means at the end of the meeting. That's how you bring it to an end. But my understanding is that it's a originally a Latin, but it's a French phrase as well. And and I'm horrible at French, but it's basically jour meant bonjour, good day. The jour part is the day. It's to a day to to reconvene the meeting. So put all together, again, the phrase basically, instead of ending a meeting, it was sort of announcing we're finishing this one up and then we will be getting together at a later date.
Yeah, it comes from the word day. Yeah, so it's like and daybreak or dawn is the same root. The root means daybreak or dawn or day, and it was about like continuing the meeting the next day, which I thought was interesting and lovely.
And this is your world, but my understanding is the D got added basically accidentally or by mistake. There doesn't really need to be a day in the word, or a D in the word, but that's the way it is.
Oh, that happens. I love those stories. Yeah, and so we missed Talk Like a Pirate Day, but, filibuster is just we have to talk about it because it's this wonderful word that relates to meetings or at least government, and it has ties to pirates.
It does indeed. And again, it's not really a Roberts word. It's not in these parliamentary books, and that's because Roberts, for instance, doesn't let anybody talk for more than 10 minutes.
Hmm.
And frequently the rules of a meeting are shorter than that. What a filibuster is, for those who haven't experienced it, is in the US Senate. A filibuster is where you talk something to death. And that's because they don't have time limits. And so you can keep talking. And in fact, there's a famous movie that's quite old at this point called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington with Jimmy Stewart in it. And one of the plot lines is that to try and stop something, he starts speaking in the US Senate and he will not stop. And he talks for days and it shuts everything down. And the word filibuster, although it's not a Roberts word, it is an interesting word. And the point you were making about pirates is apparently the word filibuster comes from filibusterus. It's a West Indian term for a small type of a boat, which I believe is a filibote. And the idea was these little boats could harass, they could annoy, they could go around bigger ships, and basically they could just cause all sorts of trouble, which is kind of a vivid image of what a filibuster in the United States Senate would be. It's someone in the minority who gets the floor and won't give it up, and they're using pirate-like or disorderly or lawless tactics to try to get their way. So it's a very visual word when you think of it as piratical.
Right. Yeah, and then the word about the boat, it goes back ultimately to the Dutch, to, freebooter,
Hmm.
I think I don't know how to say it in the Dutch, but, it's what pirates were called, and it literally means free booty, like free, plunder, and boot is really an interesting word because there are 3 different kinds of boot. So there's the boot, at least, probably more. There's the boot you wear on your foot, and that comes from one origin. And then there's a type of boot that I thought might be the origin of booty, which is it means extra. So, like if you say, "Oh, we're having ice cream, but then we're getting sprinkles to boot," that meaning of boot comes from I think an old English word that means to make something better. And in business deals, you can also have the boot, which is extra money that you're or consider, money or stuff that you give to sort of sweeten the deal. But then booty, which is what pirates get, actually comes from a third origin.
Hmm.
So, and that meant, oh, I have to look at it. It meant it's just completely different. So, but to filibuster also goes back to pirates and their free booty. So it's just a
Which
lot of
again,
cool.
the word's thrown around a lot without knowing the history. You don't have to know it to know what the word means, but it sort of adds color to it once you get all this history. I'll even mention that the US Congress, as I understand it, also used to allow people to talk indefinitely until a particular congressman in the early 1800s apparently took them up on that. And Congress passed a rule that limited debate to 1 hour. And I always thought it would be interesting to be the person who gets asked, what was your contribution in Congress? And the answer is, well, I talked so much that they adopted a rule that wouldn't allow people to talk forever anymore.
Today, he would have been a podcaster. So, how about, the one of the words on your list was ex officio, and I don't think I know how to use that word.
Well, and that's a Latin word, only seen sometimes not really in meetings, but it has to do with organizations. An ex officio member is someone who has not been elected to a position, but they're in a position because of some other office they hold. Like the governor might be an ex officio member of a school board of trustees. Or a treasurer might be an ex officio member of the finance committee. An ex officio just means out of or from officio office. So it's Latin. And it basically means I'm serving out of this office that I serve, meaning I'm on the committee because I'm treasurer. And if I resign as treasurer and someone else comes in as treasurer, they're now going to serve in this position instead of me because you're serving on it because of some other office that you hold.
Yeah, so it's essentially the office that serves instead of the person, like.
And they were not elected. They're serving because of this other office. So yes, that's correct.
Mhm. And what about abstain?
Abstain is to not vote. In parliamentary procedure, you don't have to. You don't have to vote. You could vote in favor of something. You could vote against something, but you also have the option of not voting. If it's a voice vote, you just stay quiet. And it's Middle English, as I understand it, from Old French abstenir, which basically is the same background as abstinence, in the parliamentary world, to abstain means I choose not to vote. Some chairs will actually call on those who wish to abstain, but the parliamentary books say don't do that because these people don't wish to have attention drawn to themselves and don't wish to vote, so don't make it part of the vote.
Mhm. I thought it was interesting that it was first used in the, not drinking alcohol sense. So the original meaning, was to not drink alcohol, and then it was in 1796 that it was first used to talk about not voting. So.
So the alcohol connection was around far longer than the meeting connection, it sounds like.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, is proxy an abbreviation?
It is, and it's a good one, probably. Proxy is also a Latin word in countries, as I understand it, that follow Roman law, or again, in Rome. It's an agent who represents other people in court. And the long word, or the official word, as I understand it, is procurator, which I'm going to say very slowly because I could mess that up. And a procurator is someone who is practicing procuracy. And a proxy is a much better and easier way to say either of those two long words that I'm not going to try again.
And a
And so
proxy
go ahead.
a proxy is someone you send to do something on your behalf, right?
At a meeting. So much like I said, it's someone who represents someone else in court. I could send Mignon as my proxy if it's allowed by statute. I could send Mignon as a proxy to a meeting to speak on my behalf, or maybe I will just give her authority to vote on my behalf. But if she goes to the meeting, it counts as though I'm at the meeting and she is there on my behalf as proxy.
Yeah, and the origin of that one is interesting too. It comes from a word that means to manage, and so proxy is also related to procure. So if you procure something, you're sort of it goes back to the idea of managing that process or getting what you need.
And it makes sense to me, and I like the abbreviation, but I have pondered that I have never in my life ever encountered the word procurator or procuracy used in normal English.
Right. Right. Now, one we have to talk about that is really interesting because a lot of people get confused about it is to table something. I have been in meetings where people talk about tabling things, just regular, business meetings, but not everyone is sure what it means.
Well, and that's one of those words that I was mentioning a bit ago. It's sort of like calling the previous question or to move the previous question, which is a way you close debate. Table is another one of those words that if you don't have the secret handshake, you may wonder what are they talking about? And in America, to table a motion, and it's a very visual motion, to table means to basically put something on a table that you're going to come back to later, meaning it is a motion to temporarily delay something while you're handling something of more importance. But when you mention it's got some interestingness to it, in different parts of the world, it means completely different things. In England and in Parliament, to table something means to put it on the table so that we will now begin consideration of it. And the exact opposite is true in Robert's Rules of Order in the United States, where normally table means to delay or to get rid of something. So it's the reverse of the same word.
Yeah, no, I've seen, British people and American people who said, "I always thought this meant the opposite because they mean the opposite in British English and American English. You can think about, in British English, it's as if the table is in front of you or in the middle of the circle of where everyone's meeting, so you're putting it on the table to bring it forward. And in American English, it's more like the table is off to the side, way in the back, and we're just gonna put it on the table and maybe forget about it.
And so if you visit Parliament as an American, or if you're watching C-SPAN in Europe, you might wonder, why is this the complete reverse of what I think it is? But I think it was George Bernard Shaw who said that we were two countries divided by a common language. In fact, you asked about parliamentarians earlier. I'll mention that in the United States, a parliamentarian is someone who advises on parliamentary procedure. But in many parts of the world, if you show up and say, I'm a parliamentarian, they would assume that means you're an elected official because you are a member of that government's parliament. And so, yet again, a word that means very different things depending on where you are.
Yeah, interesting. You have to be careful how you introduce yourself to people in other countries, Jim. Let's finish up this main section talking about the word minutes because the minutes of a meeting were interesting too.
Well, and minutes sounds to me, some of those you said earlier, if you had to figure it out, if I had to figure it out on my own, I'd think, oh, minutes. Of course, minutes are a record of what was done at the meeting. It's sort of a shorthand version of everything that happened in the meeting. It is not a record of what was said. It is a record of what was done. But of course, minutes, oh, we're keeping minutes because that means the time. Somehow we're writing down what we did with our time. But that's not really what it comes from at all. It's a Latin term that means minuta scriptura, and that just means small notes, which is a pretty good description of what it is. It's just small notes about what happened at the meeting, but it's not based on time or have anything to do with time.
Yeah, I would have guessed it was. That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Our Grammarpalooza subscribers, our premium subscribers, are going to get an additional segment at the end. We're going to talk about synchronous versus asynchronous meetings and who was this Robert's guy, Robert's Rules of Order, and some of Jim's book recommendations. But for the rest of you, thanks for joining us. And Jim, where can people find you?
For parliamentary procedure, our firm's website is at www.jimslaughter.com. There's lots of free resources there, charts, articles, and information on the parliamentary organizations in the country.
Thank you so much.